Greetings. This is Dr. Seth Ward, and this is a brief PowerPoint about modern Judaism. Now we're going to turn to Western Europe. I have some maps. I believe the maps are still up on the web. At the beginning of this period, there were international connections, money lending, involvement in finance, and a shared ability in Hebrew and some of the other language gave Jews of Western Europe international connections. And the Spanish expulsion created waves of Sephardic migrations and enriched the Jewish life in places like Amsterdam and the Rhineland and northern Italy, especially in Greece. Land of Israel eventually was a land to which they came. Some of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews moved to North Africa, and many of them moved to the New World, although in the Western Hemisphere it was not possible to return to open practice of Judaism, with the exception of places like New Amsterdam that were under Dutch administration and eventually the British administration after that. So parts of Brazil for a short period of time when it was under the Dutch, and some of the islands in the Caribbean and so on. But in Spanish and Portuguese, Latin America, southwestern United States, or what today is southwestern United States, most of the Caribbean, Brazil, and so on, there were descendants of Sephardic Jews, some of whom kept up their financial connections with the Jewish world, but they were not able to practice Jewish life openly. The kings and nobles, as I mentioned before, in Poland and Lithuania also welcomed the Jews. So did the Ottomans. Sometimes said that Bayezid in 1492, as the Jews were being expelled from Spain, talked about Ferdinand and Isabella as being stupid. They impoverished their kingdom and enriched his own. Bayezid probably never said this. It was probably created by a Jewish historian about 50 or 60 years later. What about the language? Yiddish and German were spoken by Jews before migrating to Poland, and it's probable that Yiddish already began. The earliest background of Yiddish may have been from parts of Europe that had Slavic words, because there's some very old Slavic words, and there are words that come from Eastern or Southern, Western or Southern Europe as well in popular Yiddish language. On the whole, though, Yiddish is very similar to a dialect of German. I already talked about the Council of Four Lands and the Khmelnytsky Revolt in what was originally a separate lecture on Eastern. In Western Europe, there was a renaissance in interest in Hebrew as part of the overall Renaissance. Johannes Reuchlin defended the Talmud, but he was a Hebrew scholar. Luther was a Hebrew scholar and translated the Bible into German directly from Hebrew. Daniel Bomberg, not Jewish, opened up a Hebrew printing press, and had Jacob ben Chaim, who was Jewish, eventually converted to Christianity, wrote important commentaries and made sure that many of the classic Jewish works were available for purchase in print in the early 16th century. By the late 16th century, works like the Shulchan Aruch were tremendously more important than they might have been because of the quick turnaround into the printing press and ready availability for purchase. I'm only going to mention some of the people at the bottom in England for this slide. Milton, Paradise Lost, some poetry. Milton knew some Hebrew, had Hebrew words in his poetry. John Selden was probably the greatest Hebrew scholar of the time, but most of the people of the late 1500s and 1600s in England most of the intellectuals had some Hebrew training. Isaac Newton, anybody else you can think of. There was a person named Seth Ward. That's not a reference to me. It is a reference to the Bishop of Salisbury, who also was a Hebrew scholar. There were no openly active Jews, however, in England until 1655. Oliver Cromwell readmitted the Jews in 1655. There probably were some Spanish heritage converso descendants who may even have secretly maintained Jewish identity, probably if they were first, even second generation after 1492, 1497. In other words, in the early 1500s, they may even have had some Hebrew knowledge. But by the late 1500s, early 1600s, Hebrew knowledge in England was something that was learned, and it was not something that was a living tradition from Jews who had it there. That changed somewhat after 1655. The first European ghettos, as such, were in Venice, and the word is an Italian word. Pope Paul IV walled in the Jews in 1555. There was a Mellah in Fez in North Africa a little bit earlier. This is not to say that there weren't Jewish neighborhoods, and sometimes even Jewish neighborhoods, which had a separate entrance prior to that. But the idea of ghettos and the idea of moving Jews into the ghetto and moving them in and having the external power, the king or the duke, construct a wall around the Jewish neighborhood that had not been there before, this is an invention of the early modern world. Luther is the symbol of the Protestant Reformation, and his famous 95 Theses are about 100 years ago. They were posted in 1517. Luther wrote a number of books about the Jews in the early part of his career. That Jesus Christ was born a Jew, often seen as being an opening towards the Jewish communities in modern Europe. Later on in his career, he wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies, and on the Shem HaMeforash, the secret name of God, according to the Jewish tradition, that is written with 4 letters. The Shem HaMeforash is a very vindictive and nasty book about the Jews. It has not seen very many printings. On the other hand, The Jews and Their Lies, also not a bestseller by any means during Luther's lifetime, was reprinted during the Nazi era, and scholars sometimes are happy to draw lines between some of the recommendations of Luther and some of the things implemented by the Nazis against them. I do have to say that years ago when I read the material, it was not so much the theological problems that Luther had with Judaism, or even his anti-Jewish approach, but his idea that the magistrate, the secular government, should implement these ideas in ways that would lead to expulsion or killing of Jews, that I found problematic and most scary in Luther's work. On the other hand, Lutheranism did not as a whole, you can't blame Lutheranism for being anti-Semitic any more or less than any other communities were. And the Nazi movement should be seen not as the manifestation of Luther, but as the response of a very rabid nationalism in the 19th century, and a very non-religious movement. Salamone Rossi lived at least until 1622. In 1622, he published parts for musical renditions of some of the best-known Jewish prayers. Rossi also was a well-known composer and is responsible for improving, or I should say, inventing some of the musical formats of the Renaissance. His sister was a performer as well. He worked with Monteverdi. And I put this slide in to remind us that the cultural creativity of early modern times was not merely in the development of literature and secularism and some of the many other movements, but also in music, and well, especially in music compared to some of the other fine arts. The slide also indicates that in early modern Italy there were Germans. They were called Tedeschi. There are Spanish Jews. There are Levantine Jews. There were old Italian communities and many other groups who had found their way to Renaissance Italy. The Dutch freed themselves from Spain in 1579, and Amsterdam, I should say the Netherlands in general, was a place in which Oriol da Costa and especially Benedict Spinoza could be active. It was Dutch Jews that arranged for the Jewish community in Britain to readmit Jews in the 1650s. Spinoza was able to, as it were, leave Judaism without also becoming a Christian, and to work independently, to work with and in concert, or I should say, to read and to be read by some of the people of his times, writing in Latin. I'll leave the discussion of court Jews in depth for another time, but at this point, the 30 Years' War and the religious wars of Europe allowed for a resolution in which the religion belonged to the state. Cuius regio, eius religio. The one who has the rule, that person has religion. But the Jews had already in medieval times been protected wards of the king, and at this time the status of Jews in the courts of kings and dukes and counts and whatever became more and more important, and they were important in finance. On this slide, I'm going to concentrate only on a small number of ideas. Moses Mendelssohn died in 1786, and he is a symbol of the Enlighteners. He wrote some very important works, and his work is characterized as saying that one should be a Jew at home and a mensch, a man in the street. He did try to justify the influence and the participation of Jews in secular Russian European society, and to make it possible for them to do so. He himself was religious all his life, although his sons and especially his grandchildren, some of them retained Judaism. Many of them, however, converted to Christianity because society had not yet become totally neutral with respect to religious identification. The French Revolution in the 1780s, the 1789 and onward, a very famous statement of Clermont-Tonnerre, everything must be refused to the Jews as a nation, everything granted to the Jews as individuals. Napoleon convened a Sanhedrin to work out how the Jews would be totally French citizens. They were given many individual rights, as I said, individual civil rights, but the kind of corporate existence that they had had previous to that time and was fully developed in the Eastern European world, that was something that did not happen in France. And you might say that just as in the late 18th through late 19th century, slaves were liberated all over the world, a little bit broader period from a little bit before the French Revolution in Spain, in Austria in the 1770s, Up to the late 19th and early 20th century, Jews were also emancipated. Their situation may have not been quite like that of serfs, but in many ways they also were not free to live wherever they wanted or to be involved in all the businesses they wanted or to get education in universities and so on.